In 1890, one man was fired from his job. 24 years later, 20 million people were dead. Otto von Bismarck had spent nearly 3 decades building the most sophisticated political machine in the world, a system of alliances so carefully balanced that it kept all of Europe at peace for an entire generation. But Bismarck had made one catastrophic mistake. He built a machine that only he knew how to operate. This is the story of the most brilliant political mind of the 19th century, and the quiet catastrophe that began the moment he left the room. The year is 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had redrawn the map of Europe with cannon fire and imperial ambition, is finally defeated. The great powers of the continent gather in Vienna, dressed in their finest coats, to answer a question that will shape the next century. How do you prevent this from ever happening again? Their answer was the Congress of Vienna. Under the guiding hand of the Austrian statesman Clemens von Metternich, Europe's conservative monarchies constructed what they called a balance of power. No single nation would be permitted to dominate the continent as France had done. Thrones would be restored. Borders would be redrawn. And above all else, the dangerous spirit of revolutionary nationalism, that intoxicating idea that ordinary people might reshape their own governments, would be kept firmly suppressed. It was, in many ways, an elegant system. And in the center of it all sat a patchwork of 39 German-speaking states, bound together in something called the German Confederation. Not a nation. Not an empire. Something far more complicated and, in hindsight, far more unstable. The Confederation was presided over by Austria, the old Habsburg Empire, which had every reason to keep its German neighbors fractured and weak. A unified Germany would be a rival. Divided, the German states were manageable. The Austrian Foreign Minister Metternich understood this perfectly. Unity was the enemy of order, and order was everything. But order is never permanent. By 1848, 3 decades of suppressed grievances erupted across Europe in a wave of revolutions. In the German states, liberals and nationalists flooded the streets, dreaming of a unified German nation built on constitutional principles. Delegates gathered in Frankfurt to write a constitution to build something new from the ground up. It failed. Spectacularly. The Frankfurt Parliament dissolved into endless debate, couldn't agree on borders, couldn't agree on leadership, and ultimately couldn't compel the kings and princes to surrender their power. The revolutionaries had passion. They lacked armies. Order was restored. Metternich's Europe, bruised but largely intact, reasserted itself. And yet something had shifted beneath the surface. Prussia had been watching. The northern German kingdom had spent the first half of the 19th century quietly building, constructing railroads and steel mills and a military reputation for ruthless efficiency. While Austria looked backward toward a feudal, multi-ethnic empire, Prussia looked forward. Its Zollverein, a customs union that linked German economies together in commercial partnership, was weaving connections that no parliament had managed to forge through idealism alone. The failure of 1848 taught a generation a brutal lesson. Speeches and constitutions could not unify Germany. That would require something harder and colder and far more calculated. Into this frustrated, restless, ambitious world, a young Prussian nobleman named Otto von Bismarck was paying very close attention. Otto von Bismarck entered the world on April 1st, 1815, the same year the Congress of Vienna was redrawing everything around him. He was born at the family estate in Schönhausen, a manor house sitting among the flat, windswept fields of Brandenburg, Prussia. His father, Ferdinand, was a classic junker, a member of that proud, stubborn class of Prussian landed nobility who measured their worth in soil and military service rather than wealth or intellect. His mother, Wilhelmine, was sharper, more ambitious, and determined that her son would achieve something greater than managing crops and tenants. She pushed him toward education. He obliged after a fashion. At the universities of Göttingen and Berlin, young Bismarck distinguished himself primarily through excess. He drank heavily, fought somewhere between 25 and 30 dueling bouts, depending on whose account you believe, and accumulated debts with cheerful indifference. He was brilliant, and everyone around him knew it, which seemed to excuse, in his own mind at least, virtually everything else. The young aristocrat had enormous energy and absolutely no idea what to do with it. The civil service was supposed to provide an answer. It did not. Bismarck worked briefly as a Prussian bureaucrat and found the experience suffocating. He was not a man built to receive instructions from above. He resigned, returned to the family estates, and spent several years managing farmland, gambling, carousing, and earning a reputation among local neighbors as the mad junker. What saved him, or perhaps more accurately redirected him, was love and faith arriving together. His marriage to Johanna von Puttkamer in 1847 introduced him to her family's deep pietist Lutheran devotion. Something in it reached him. Bismarck emerged from this period transformed, genuinely so, describing a faith that gave his restless character something solid to anchor against. He would carry that faith and his fierce loyalty to the Prussian monarchy it reinforced for the rest of his life. Then 1848 arrived and Bismarck found his arena. While liberals flooded the streets demanding constitutions and unified governments, Bismarck was horrified. Where others saw progress, he saw chaos threatening the divine order of things. He made himself heard. His speeches in the Prussian assembly defending the monarchy were furious, combative, and completely unafraid of being unpopular. He practically celebrated being unpopular. Liberals despised him, which he seemed to regard as a reliable sign he was doing something right. That defiant loyalty caught the attention of the Prussian court. In 1851, King Frederick William IV appointed Bismarck as Prussia's representative to the German Confederation in Frankfurt. It was his first major stage, and he stepped onto it with characteristic confidence. What he discovered in Frankfurt would change everything he thought he understood about Austria, about German politics, and about what Prussia would have to become. Prussia in 1862 was a kingdom at war with itself, and not a single shot had been fired. The conflict was quieter than that, fought in parliamentary chambers rather than on open fields, but it carried real stakes. King Wilhelm I had a vision for his army. Working closely with his war minister, Albrecht von Roon, Wilhelm wanted to expand the Prussian military, extend mandatory service from 2 years to 3, and restructure the reserve forces to bring them firmly under royal control. To Wilhelm, this was not ambition. It was necessity. Prussia's army was the foundation of everything. The liberal-dominated parliament saw it differently. To the liberals, this was a naked power grab dressed in military uniform. They refused to approve the budget. Then they refused again. The deadlock stretched on for months, hardening on both sides until compromise seemed not just unlikely but almost unthinkable. Wilhelm found himself trapped between his constitutional obligations and his absolute conviction that a strong army was Prussia's only future. He was a soldier at his core, not a politician, and the paralysis tormented him. By the autumn of 1862, he was privately drafting an instrument of abdication. Then, Roon sent a telegram. "Delay is dangerous," it read. "Come." The man Roon wanted his king to meet was Otto von Bismarck, newly returned from his posting as Prussian ambassador to France. Wilhelm summoned him to Babelsberg Palace on September 22nd. What passed between them that afternoon was less a formal interview than a negotiation between two stubborn men deciding whether they could use each other. Bismarck told the king plainly that he would govern without parliamentary approval if necessary, that he would fight the liberal majority rather than surrender to it. Wilhelm, who had been looking for a reason not to abdicate, found one. On September 23, 1862, Otto von Bismarck was appointed Minister-President of Prussia. Within days, he stood before the Parliamentary Budget Committee and delivered words that would echo across the next century. Military power, he told them, would not be built through speeches and majority votes. The great questions of the day, he said, will not be decided by speeches and the resolutions of majorities, but by iron and blood. The phrase was deliberately provocative, almost a calculated insult to every liberal principle in the room. The liberals were appalled. The newspapers thundered against him. Bismarck had intended every word exactly as they landed. But rhetoric alone was not enough. Bismarck needed to actually govern. And so, with Parliament refusing to pass a budget, he did something that no minister in Prussia had dared attempt before. He simply collected taxes and funded the army anyway, citing a gap in the constitution that offered no clear guidance on what happened when Parliament and Crown could not agree. It was legally dubious, arguably authoritarian, and completely effective. The Prussian state continued to function. The army received its funding. The liberals fumed but found themselves outmaneuvered. This constitutional gamble revealed something essential about Bismarck's character. He did not operate from ideology. He operated from will, from a ruthless assessment of what was possible and what he could make others accept after the fact. He was not interested in being admired. He was interested in winning. The liberals called him dangerous. They were not wrong. But in the winter of 1862, gathered in cold parliamentary halls, they had not yet begun to understand what dangerous truly meant when Otto von Bismarck had a foreign policy in mind. By 1863, Bismarck had secured his position at home. Now he turned his eyes to the map. The question of Schleswig and Holstein had haunted European diplomacy for decades. These two duchies, nestled at the base of the Danish peninsula, were tangled in a knot of competing claims so complicated that Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, once joked that only 3 men had ever truly understood the Schleswig-Holstein question. One was dead. One had gone mad. And the third was himself, and he had forgotten. The basic problem was this. Holstein was part of the German Confederation and populated largely by Germans. Schleswig was more mixed, with Danish and German populations living in uncomfortable proximity. Both duchies had long existed in a peculiar relationship with the Danish crown, bound by treaty but never fully absorbed into Denmark proper. When the Danish King Frederick VII died in November 1863 with no direct heir, his successor Christian IX almost immediately signed a new constitution attempting to formally incorporate Schleswig into Denmark. For German nationalists, this was provocation. For Bismarck, it was opportunity. He moved with a precision that left his opponents scrambling to understand what had happened until it was already finished. Rather than positioning Prussia as the defender of German nationalism, which would have alarmed Austria and the other German states, Bismarck framed the conflict in terms of treaty law. The Danes, he argued simply, had violated the agreements of 1852 governing the duchies. This was a matter of legal obligation, not nationalist sentiment. Austria, the other great power of the German world and Prussia's future rival, found itself with no principled reason to refuse participation. To stand aside would be to accept Danish treaty violations. And so Austria joined. The war began in February 1864. It was swift and one-sided. Prussian forces crossed into Schleswig and pushed the Danish army back with a military efficiency that surprised even some Prussians. By the summer, Denmark was finished. Christian IX surrendered both duchies. The peace settlement, signed in Vienna in October 1864, transferred Schleswig and Holstein to joint Austro-Prussian administration. Joint administration. Two great powers sharing two small territories with no agreement on what would happen next. To any diplomat watching, this should have raised immediate concern. Shared sovereignty between rivals is not a settlement. It is a delay. And Bismarck had designed it that way. Every point of friction between Prussia and Austria over the duchies was a future lever. Every administrative dispute, every disagreement over governance, every moment where Viennese and Berliner interests rubbed against each other in these small corridors of Holstein could be exploited. Bismarck had not just won a war. He had manufactured a grievance that he could deploy whenever it suited him. What made the operation truly remarkable was what the rest of Europe failed to do. Britain, France, and Russia all watched the Danish crisis with varying degrees of concern, but none intervened. Bismarck had read each of them correctly. Britain was distracted and divided. Napoleon III of France was sympathetic to the idea of national self-determination and could not easily oppose it. Russia remembered Prussian neutrality during the Crimean War and felt no urgency to help Denmark. One by one, the powers that might have checked him found reasons to remain still. It was a pattern Bismarck would repeat. Identify the target, frame the conflict on narrow legal or diplomatic grounds, ensure the other major powers had no compelling reason to act, and then strike. Denmark had been a rehearsal. The real performance was still being written, and Austria, standing beside Prussia in the ashes of that small victory, had not yet realized it was holding a script it had not read. Austria never saw it coming. Or perhaps, more accurately, Austria saw it coming and could not find a way to stop it. By 1865, the joint administration of Schleswig and Holstein had become exactly what Bismarck intended it to be, a slow-burning fuse. Prussia and Austria bickered over governance, over customs arrangements, over the future status of the duchies. Each dispute was another entry in a ledger that Bismarck was carefully keeping. When the moment arrived, he would present the bill. But before he could move against Austria, he had to ensure that Austria stood alone. He began with France. Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, was a man of grand ambitions and limited patience, susceptible to flattery and intoxicated by the idea of French territorial expansion. Bismarck met with him at Biarritz in October 1865 and, without making any formal commitment, left Napoleon with the comfortable impression that a Prussian victory over Austria might somehow benefit France. Perhaps territorial adjustments along the Rhine. Perhaps something in Belgium. Napoleon never received anything in writing. What he received was hope, and hope was enough to keep him neutral. Russia required less effort. The Tsar had not forgotten that Prussia had stood quietly sympathetic during the Polish uprising of 1863, while France and Britain had made disapproving noises. Russian goodwill had been earned cheaply and would now pay dividends. Britain, absorbed in its own parliamentary convulsions and philosophically committed to non-intervention in continental affairs, required no management at all. That left one more piece to place on the board. In April 1866, Prussia signed a secret alliance with the Kingdom of Italy. Italy wanted Venice, still held by Austria. Austria would now face enemies on two fronts, her armies forced to divide against threats from north and south simultaneously. The trap was set. In June 1866, Bismarck engineered a final provocation over the administration of Holstein. Austria, her patience exhausted, took the dispute to the German Confederation. Prussia declared this a violation of their bilateral arrangement and moved troops into Holstein. The war had begun. What followed stunned Europe. The Austro-Prussian War lasted precisely 7 weeks. The decisive moment came on July 3rd, 1866, in Bohemia, near the town of Königgrätz. Austrian and Prussian forces met in one of the largest battles fought in Europe since Waterloo, roughly 450,000 men clashing across rolling farmland in summer heat. The Prussian army, equipped with the needle gun rifle that allowed soldiers to reload while lying prone, cut through Austrian formations with devastating speed. By evening, the Austrian army was broken. The road to Vienna lay open. And here, Otto von Bismarck did something that no one expected. He stopped. King Wilhelm I wanted to march on Vienna. His generals wanted triumphal entry into the Habsburg capital, humiliation, conquest. Bismarck refused. He reportedly wept, arguing desperately with his monarch, threatening to throw himself from a window if the king would not listen. Whether the theatrics were genuine or calculated, the argument was iron hard in its logic. A humiliated Austria would become a permanent enemy, nursing its wounds and waiting for revenge. A defeated but dignified Austria might, in time, become something useful. The Peace of Prague, signed in August 1866, was astonishingly lenient. Austria paid no reparations. It lost no territory to Prussia directly. It was simply removed from German affairs entirely, excluded from the new political order Bismarck was now constructing. That order took shape almost immediately. The North German Confederation, established in 1867, gathered 22 states under Prussian leadership. It had a parliament, a federal council, and a chancellor. That chancellor was Bismarck. 4 years earlier, he had been a controversial minister fighting a constitutional crisis in Prussia. Now he presided over a unified northern Germany stretching from the Rhine to the Russian border. The southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, remained formally independent. But they had signed secret defensive treaties with Prussia. They were, in every practical sense, already within Bismarck's orbit. One rival remained. France had watched all of this from a careful distance, still waiting for. The generals stood outside Vienna and dreamed of glory. Bismarck stood beside the king and thought about what came next. This is the moment that separates the tactician from the statesman. Any general can win a war. The rarer gift is knowing what to do with the victory once the smoke has cleared, and what not to do with it. In August of 1866, with Austria prostrate and the Habsburg capital within reach, Bismarck made the choice that would define his entire career, and arguably the entire trajectory of European history that followed. He chose restraint. The Treaty of Prague, signed on the 23rd of August, 1866, was unlike any peace settlement Europe had seen in living memory. Austria surrendered its influence over German affairs, accepting permanent exclusion from the emerging Prussian-led order. But Prussia took no Austrian territory, demanded no reparations, required no triumphal parade through Vienna's streets. The Habsburg Emperor Franz Joseph I was defeated, not destroyed. Bismarck's reasoning was cold and clear. Austria, humiliated, would become what France had become after Waterloo, a nation organized around the memory of its wound, patient and implacable in its hunger for revenge. Austria, treated with a degree of dignity, might become something else entirely. A neighbor, a partner, perhaps, when the time demanded it, an ally. The contrast with Napoleon III's approach was instructive and not flattering to the French emperor. Napoleon had spent his reign collecting defeated enemies the way other men collect grievances. His interventions in Italy, his adventures in Mexico, his endless search for territorial compensation had left France surrounded by nations that feared or resented her. When Napoleon sought allies, he found that he had spent them all. Bismarck operated from the opposite principle. Never take more than you need, because you will need the loser later. It sounds almost modest for a man engineering the transformation of Central Europe. But modesty had nothing to do with it. This was calculation of the coldest possible kind. His fury at the generals who wanted to march on Vienna was not sentiment. When he reportedly threatened to throw himself from a window if the king would not listen to reason, this was a man who understood that the war had already achieved its purpose. Prussia had demonstrated military supremacy. Austria had accepted exclusion from German affairs. Anything beyond that was appetite dressed up as ambition, and appetite was a luxury Bismarck could not afford. Wars, in his conception, were not ends in themselves. They were instruments, expensive and dangerous ones, to be put down the moment they had done their work. The objective was never the destruction of the enemy. The objective was the political outcome that came after. This philosophy would serve him 3 times. Against Denmark, a quick surgical strike for the duchies. Against Austria, a short, sharp war followed by a generous peace. The third application was coming, larger and more consequential than either of the first 2, and Bismarck was already thinking about the morning after that one as well. France had watched the Treaty of Prague with growing unease. Napoleon III had expected something from Prussian success, some territorial reward for his neutrality. He received nothing. The comfortable impression Bismarck had cultivated at Biarritz had evaporated, replaced by something colder and considerably more dangerous. A France that felt cheated, watching a newly confident Prussia consolidate its grip on northern Germany, would not remain patient forever. Bismarck understood this perfectly. The question was not whether that confrontation was coming. The question was how to make certain that when it arrived, Prussia would be ready and France would stand alone. 4 years passed between the Treaty of Prague and the final act of Bismarck's design. 4 years of consolidation, of watching, of waiting for the moment France would hand him the excuse he needed. It came from the most unlikely of places: Spain. In September of 1868, a revolution had toppled Queen Isabella II from the Spanish throne, leaving a crown with no one to wear it. After 2 years of searching, the Spanish government settled on a candidate, Prince Leopold of the House of Hohenzollern, a distant relation of the Prussian royal family. To outside eyes, this was a minor diplomatic matter. To Bismarck, it was a loaded pistol, and he intended to pull the trigger. The prospect of a Hohenzollern king in Madrid was, from the French perspective, a nightmare. France would be flanked on 2 sides by the same royal house. Napoleon III's government reacted with exactly the alarm Bismarck had anticipated. Paris issued furious protests. The pressure worked, at least initially. In July of 1870, Prince Leopold's father announced that his son would withdraw his candidacy. A wiser man than Napoleon III might have accepted this as a victory and moved on. Instead, the French foreign minister demanded more. France wanted a formal guarantee from King Wilhelm I himself, a solemn promise that no Hohenzollern would ever seek the Spanish throne again. It was an extraordinary demand, the kind of thing one nation asks of another only when it has already decided to make an enemy. Wilhelm, who was taking the waters at the spa town of Ems, received the French ambassador twice. He declined, politely but firmly, to give any such permanent guarantee. Then he sent a telegram to Bismarck in Berlin, summarizing the encounter. Bismarck read it over dinner with 2 senior generals. The atmosphere, by his own later account, was bleak. The telegram as written seemed merely diplomatic, a French demand politely refused. It would not inflame anyone. It was not the spark he needed. So he made a small edit. He did not fabricate. He insisted on this distinction, though history has not always been generous about it. What he did was compress, removing the cushioning language, stripping away the courtesies, leaving only the bare bones of a French demand and a Prussian refusal. The resulting document read not as a diplomatic exchange, but as a public snub. France had been turned away at the door. Bismarck released the edited dispatch to the press. The effect was immediate and precisely calculated. In Paris, crowds poured into the streets demanding war. The French press howled about Prussian arrogance. Napoleon III, ailing, politically weakened, and surrounded by advisors competing to seem the most patriotic, found himself with almost no room to maneuver. On the 19th of July, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. Bismarck had his war. More importantly, he had the war on his terms. Because the French declaration was the key to everything. The southern German states, Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, had watched Prussian expansion with considerable wariness. They shared culture and language with their northern neighbors, but they also valued their independence. They had stayed outside the North German Confederation. No Prussian pressure had moved them. But a French invasion was something else entirely. Ancient instincts stirred. The treaties of mutual defense that Bismarck had quietly negotiated after 1866 now activated. The southern states marched not because Prussia commanded them, but because France had threatened Germany. And in that moment, the difference between northern and southern Germans ceased to matter. This was the trap within the trap. Not merely a war with France, but a war in which France appeared as the aggressor, and in which every German state, north and south, would fight together under Prussian leadership. The army that mobilized in the summer of 1870 was something Germany had never fielded before, a genuinely national force carrying the weight of collective purpose. Bismarck watched it form and knew he had his answer. The question now was what to do with the victory that was coming. He was already thinking about the morning after. The German army that crossed into France in the summer of 1870 moved with a speed that stunned observers across Europe. Within weeks, French forces were in disarray. Within months, the war would be over. But the final act would unfold not on a battlefield. It would unfold in a mirror. At Sedan, a fortress town in the rolling hills of northeastern France, the decisive moment arrived on the 1st of September 1870. More than 100,000 French troops found themselves encircled, caught in a trap from which no tactical ingenuity could extract them. The Prussian artillery worked methodically through the day, reducing French positions one by one. By evening, Napoleon III himself had ridden among his own lines waving a white flag, desperate to stop the dying. The Emperor of France surrendered personally the following morning. He handed his sword to King Wilhelm I on the 2nd of September, 1870. It was perhaps the most humiliating moment any European monarch had suffered in living memory. But the war did not end at Sedan. A new French government, the Government of National Defense, declared a republic in Paris and announced it would fight on. And so began one of the most agonizing episodes of the entire conflict, the Siege of Paris. For 4 months, the Prussian army encircled the French capital. Inside, the population endured cold, hunger, and the steady diminishment of hope. Parisians ate rats, then zoo animals. The bombardment that began in January of 1871 rattled windows and shattered nerves in equal measure. The city that had considered itself the center of civilization was being slowly starved into submission. Bismarck watched the siege with impatience. He wanted it finished. He had somewhere to be. The somewhere was Versailles, where the Prussian military headquarters had been established in the palace of the Sun King himself. And it was there, in the Hall of Mirrors, on the 18th of January, 1871, that the moment Bismarck had engineered across nearly a decade finally arrived. The hall was blazing with light. German princes and generals in full uniform lined the walls beneath the painted ceilings. King Wilhelm I of Prussia stood before them. And in that gilded room, built by Louis XIV to project French supremacy to the world, the German Empire was proclaimed. Bismarck had done it. Through blood and iron, through edited telegrams and careful wars, Through the precise manipulation of fear and pride and national feeling, he had achieved what no German statesman before him had managed. Germany was unified. He did not look happy. Photographs from the period show a man already calculating the next problem. The problem was the peace. In May of 1871, the Treaty of Frankfurt formally ended the war. France would pay a staggering indemnity of 5 billion francs. And France would surrender Alsace and most of Lorraine, 2 provinces of mixed German and French character, home to more than 1.5 million people who had no say in the matter. It was the military commanders who pressed hardest for the annexation. They wanted a buffer. They wanted the fortresses. Bismarck had his doubts. He expressed them privately more than once. Taking Alsace-Lorraine, he feared, was swallowing a piece of France that France would never digest losing. Every French child born after 1871 would grow up knowing that 2 provinces had been taken. Every French government would face the question of whether to try to get them back. He was right. He took the territory anyway. It was perhaps the one moment in Bismarck's career when he allowed himself to be overruled by forces he understood perfectly and could not stop. He had built a unified Germany in a hall of mirrors, and in those mirrors, if he looked carefully, he could already see the reflection of what the future might hold. The empire was real. The resentment was already growing. And Bismarck, the man who had bent Europe to his will, now faced the harder task, keeping the peace he had shattered long enough to build something that might last. What does it mean to build a nation? Not in a romantic sense, the songs and flags and stirring speeches, but in the cold, architectural sense. What levers must be pulled, what weights balanced, what mechanisms installed so that a machine keeps running after the hand that built it is gone? Bismarck answered that question in January of 1871, and his answer revealed everything about how he understood power. The Constitution of the new German Empire was not written to protect citizens. It was not designed to express the will of the people. It was designed to be operated by one man, and that man already knew exactly who he was. On paper, the empire looked reasonable enough. There was a Kaiser, the German emperor, a position held by the Prussian king. There was a Bundesrat, a council of representatives from all 25 constituent states. There was a Reichstag, elected by universal male suffrage, which sounded impressively democratic. And above all of them, threading through every institution like a wire-carrying current, there was the Chancellor. But the architecture concealed its true logic until you examined the load-bearing walls. The Reichstag, that democratic body elected by millions of German men, could debate. It could vote on budgets, eventually. It could make noise. What it could not do was remove the Chancellor. The Chancellor did not answer to the Reichstag. He answered to the Kaiser alone. In any genuine parliamentary system, the government falls when it loses the confidence of the legislature. In Bismarck's Germany, the legislature could lose every vote that mattered, and the Chancellor would still be standing, because his standing depended on exactly one person. Prussia, meanwhile, was not merely the largest state in the empire. It was the engine. Prussia controlled enough votes in the Bundesrat to block any constitutional amendment it disliked. The Prussian king was automatically the Kaiser. And Bismarck held both positions simultaneously, serving as Imperial Chancellor of Germany and as Minister-President of Prussia at the same time. He did not have two jobs. He had one job seen from two angles. Foreign policy was his personal domain. He maintained it with the obsessive secrecy of a chess grandmaster who refuses to let anyone else see the board. Treaties were negotiated and sometimes kept deliberately obscure, known to Bismarck and to almost no one else. The system ran on his memory, his relationships, his instincts cultivated over decades of watching European courts and cabinets. And here was the flaw he either could not see or chose not to acknowledge. Every elegant machine has a tolerance built around its intended operator. Design a machine for hands of a specific size and strength, and smaller or larger hands will produce different results or break it entirely. The German Empire was built for Bismarck's hands. It required someone with his appetite for complexity, his capacity to hold contradictions in suspension, his ability to read the Kaiser, manage the princes, pacify the parliament, and simultaneously conduct the foreign policy of the most powerful continental state in Europe. It required someone who had spent 40 years learning how every gear turned. What happened when that person was gone? The machine would still run. The levers would still be there. But different hands on those levers would produce forces the system was never designed to handle. Bismarck had created something genuinely extraordinary, a unified German state that stunned the world with its speed and stability. He had also created a structural dependency so complete that the empire could not function without him. He was 65 years old when he signed his name to that constitution. He intended to run the machine himself for as long as necessary. He had not seriously planned for what came after. That oversight would define the next century of European history. The machine was built. Now someone had to protect it. Bismarck understood, with the clarity that only genuine fear produces, that unified Germany had created a problem it could not solve by existing. The very act of winning in 1871 had guaranteed new enemies. France had lost Alsace-Lorraine, 50,000 square miles of territory and nearly 1.5 million people. The humiliation at Versailles, where the German Empire had been proclaimed in the palace of Louis XIV, burned in the French national memory like an open wound. France would seek revenge. Not immediately, perhaps not even within a generation. But eventually, the pressure would build until it burst. This was not a diplomatic problem that could be negotiated away. It was a structural reality. And Bismarck, who had spent his career understanding structures, saw it with terrible precision. In the summer of 1877, dictating his thoughts in the spa town of Bad Kissingen while recovering from exhaustion, Bismarck produced what historians would later call the Kissingen Dictation. It was not a formal policy document. It was something rarer, a strategist thinking aloud on paper, following his own logic wherever it led. What he described was a picture. Not a conquest, not an empire stretching to distant horizons. A picture of relationships, a map of alignments designed to keep Germany permanently secure by keeping its enemies permanently separated. France, he wrote, would always be a threat. The goal was not to destroy France, which was impossible, but to ensure France could never find allies powerful enough to act on its grievances. The fundamental geography of the problem haunted everything. Germany sat in the center of Europe, which was simultaneously its greatest strength and its deepest vulnerability. Surround a strong man with enemies, and eventually the numbers overwhelm the strength. Bismarck knew that if France ever found a willing partner to the east, if Paris and St. Petersburg ever discovered a common cause, Germany would face war on two fronts simultaneously. That scenario was not merely dangerous. It was potentially fatal. His solution was relentless, elegant, and exhausting to maintain. Be, as he put it, one of three in a world of five great powers. Europe in the 1870s was governed by five major forces: Germany, France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Britain. Bismarck's strategic mathematics were simple. In any grouping of five, the decisive advantage goes to the power that belongs to the larger coalition. Germany must always be in the group of three. France must always be the isolated one. This meant keeping Russia aligned with Germany, or at minimum, not aligned with France. It meant keeping Austria-Hungary cooperative, even though Austria and Prussia had been enemies barely a decade before. It meant managing relationships of extraordinary complexity across half a continent, simultaneously, indefinitely, without error. Bismarck called his deepest anxiety le cauchemar des coalitions, the nightmare of coalitions. He used the French phrase deliberately, as if naming the fear in the language of the enemy gave it the shape it deserved. The nightmare was simple. That one morning, Germany would wake to find its enemies had solved the problem of each other and united against Berlin. Every treaty he would negotiate in the years ahead, every secret protocol, every carefully worded alliance was an answer to that nightmare. He was building a web with Germany at the center, threads running in every direction, each one designed to ensure that no combination of powers could ever pull tight enough to strangle what he had built. It was, by any measure, a masterwork of strategic thinking. It was also a system that required its architect to be present at all times, adjusting every thread by hand. What happened when the architect stepped away would answer the question Europe had been afraid to ask. The first thread Bismarck wove was ideological. In 1873, the emperors of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia met in Berlin and signed what became known as the Three Emperors League, the Dreikaiserbund. On the surface, it was a straightforward arrangement among conservative monarchies, a mutual pledge to consult one another and resist the revolutionary currents still moving beneath European politics. Three crowns, three dynasties, one shared terror of the mob. But ideology was only the scaffolding. The real architecture was Bismarck himself. He knew Wilhelm I. He understood Franz Joseph's cautious temperament and Russia's Tsar Alexander II well enough to read the limits of their ambitions. The League existed because Bismarck could personally manage the friction between its members. It was diplomacy as performance, sustained not by treaty language, but by the constant attention of one man who understood everyone in the room. The first test came quickly. In 1875, French military reforms moved faster than Berlin had anticipated. Germany's military establishment grew nervous, and inflammatory articles appeared in the German press asking whether France needed to be struck again before it recovered. The episode became known as the War in Sight crisis, and it alarmed all of Europe. Russia and Britain both signaled their opposition to any German aggression, and France, sensing an opportunity, made the warnings public. For the first time, Bismarck found himself on the defensive, forced to retreat from a position he claimed never to have taken. The episode revealed something important. Germany was powerful enough that even whispers of aggression triggered a continental reaction. Bismarck filed the lesson away. Germany could not afford to appear threatening. The nightmare of coalitions could be triggered not only by French grievances but by German ones. Then the Balkans arrived, as they always did, carrying catastrophe. The Ottoman Empire, which diplomats politely called the sick man of Europe, was dying in stages throughout the 1870s. As it retreated, it left behind a vacuum that both Austria-Hungary and Russia rushed to fill. Austria wanted stability in its southern borderlands and feared Slavic nationalism like a fever in its own bloodstream. Russia saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples and the champion of Orthodox Christians suffering under Ottoman rule. These positions were not compatible. They never had been. When nationalist uprisings broke out across the Balkans in 1875 and Serbia and Montenegro went to war against the Ottomans the following year, the contradictions inside the Three Emperors League became impossible to paper over. Russia wanted to support the Slavic cause. Austria-Hungary wanted to ensure that no single power, especially Russia, came to dominate the peninsula. Bismarck, caught between his two essential partners, described his position with characteristic sharpness. Germany's interests in the Balkans, he said, were not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. It was a clever line. It did not solve the problem. By 1878, Russia had gone to war with the Ottomans and won, imposing the Treaty of San Stefano, which created a large Bulgarian state that effectively extended Russian influence to the Aegean. Austria-Hungary was furious. Britain was alarmed. The settlement threatened to unravel everything Bismarck had constructed. He stepped in as the honest broker, hosting the Congress of Berlin that summer, walking a razor's edge between Russian disappointment and Austrian satisfaction, managing the crisis without destroying either relationship. He succeeded, barely. But the experience told him something he had perhaps suspected all along. Conservative solidarity was not enough. Shared monarchical values could not contain the competing ambitions of empires whose interests ran in opposite directions. The Three Emperors League was a structure built on sentiment. And sentiment, Bismarck knew better than anyone, was no foundation at all. Something harder would be needed. The Congress of Berlin opened on the 13th of June, 1878. In the Radziwill Palace, with Bismarck presiding over the most glittering assembly of statesmen Europe had seen in a generation. Benjamin Disraeli, now Lord Beaconsfield, arrived from London trailing British imperial confidence. Prince Gorchakov came from St. Petersburg, old and vain and determined to protect what Russia had won in blood. Count Andrassy represented Austria-Hungary's anxious ambitions. For 6 weeks, Bismarck moved among them, cajoling, pressuring, negotiating in corridors and over dinners, bending the raw material of competing interests into something that resembled agreement. He called himself the honest broker. It was a carefully chosen phrase. An honest broker does not advocate for himself. He facilitates. He stands above the quarrel, trusted by all parties precisely because he appears to want nothing. Bismarck understood that this posture was Germany's greatest diplomatic asset. A Germany that wanted nothing from the Balkans could manage a Balkans crisis in ways that Britain or Russia never could. The Congress produced the Treaty of Berlin, signed on the 13th of July. On paper, it was a triumph of European order. The large Bulgarian state that Russia had imposed at San Stefano was broken apart. Bulgaria was reduced. Eastern Rumelia became an autonomous province under Ottoman sovereignty rather than a Russian satellite. Bosnia and Herzegovina passed under Austro-Hungarian administration. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro received formal independence. The map was redrawn with the kind of careful geometry that diplomats prefer and that ordinary people, whose lives are rearranged by such lines, rarely do. For Britain and Austria-Hungary, the outcome was deeply satisfying. Russian expansion had been checked. The overreach of San Stefano had been reversed. The balance of power in southeastern Europe had been restored to something resembling its pre-war configuration. For Russia, it was humiliation dressed in diplomatic language. Russian soldiers had fought and died in their tens of thousands to defeat the Ottomans. Russian diplomats had imposed a bold settlement at San Stefano. And then, in a palace in Berlin, under the presidency of a man Russia had counted as a friend, those gains had been stripped away. The Tsar's government returned home with far less than it had won on the battlefield. The anger fell on Bismarck personally. Gorchakov, wounded in his considerable pride, whispered in European capitals that Germany had betrayed Russia. Russian newspapers turned venomous. Pan-Slavic voices, already suspicious of German power, found a ready audience. Within Russia's political class, the conviction hardened that Berlin could not be trusted, that the Dreikaiserbund was a mask concealing German indifference to Russian interests, that the honest broker had, in fact, been quietly working for the other side all along. It was unfair, and it was also, in the strange way of international politics, entirely understandable. Bismarck had genuinely tried to hold the balance. But Russia could not be expected to experience its humiliation as an act of friendship simply because the man presiding over it called himself neutral. The estrangement that began in the summer of 1878 would deepen steadily. The Three Emperors League, already strained before the Congress, would limp forward for a few more years before collapsing entirely. The relationship between Berlin and St. Petersburg, once warm enough to anchor Bismarck's entire system, had developed a fracture that no amount of diplomatic ingenuity could fully repair. Bismarck had brokered a settlement. He had preserved the peace of Europe, at least for the moment. But he had done so at a cost he perhaps did not yet fully reckon. Russia was leaving the room. And the question now was what he intended to build without it. What does a man do when his most important friendship has just turned cold? For Bismarck, the answer was characteristically methodical. If Russia was drifting away, then something else had to anchor the system. And that something else was Austria-Hungary. On the 7th of October 1879, Germany and Austria-Hungary signed the dual alliance in Vienna. The terms were straightforward on the surface. If either power were attacked by Russia, the other would come to its defense. If either were attacked by France, the other would maintain at minimum a posture of benevolent neutrality. Two great powers bound together by treaty, each pledging its fate to the other's security. Bismarck had pressed hard for this agreement over the objections of Kaiser Wilhelm I, who retained an old Prussian instinct for closeness with Russia and resisted the idea of an anti-Russian compact. Bismarck threatened resignation. The Kaiser relented. It was not the last time Bismarck would use that particular weapon. But here was the paradox that would haunt everything that followed. Austria-Hungary was precisely the kind of ally who created as many problems as she solved. She was restless in the Balkans, forever probing for advantage against Russian influence, forever capable of stumbling into a confrontation that could drag Germany behind her. Bismarck wanted Austria anchored and calmed, not emboldened. He wanted the dual alliance to function as a leash as much as a bond. Whether Vienna understood it that way was another question entirely. To compensate, Bismarck worked to resurrect what the Congress of Berlin had damaged. In 1881, the Three Emperors Alliance was quietly renewed, binding Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia into a fresh agreement. The three powers pledged neutrality if any one of them went to war with a fourth party, and they agreed to manage Balkan questions among themselves. It was a fragile construction, built over a fracture that everyone could feel but no one would name aloud. Russia accepted because isolation was worse. Austria accepted because Berlin required it. The agreement lasted, but it breathed uneasily. Then came Italy. In May of 1882, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy signed the Triple Alliance. On paper, it extended Germany's defensive perimeter further still. In practice, Bismarck valued Italy primarily as a counterweight against France. Italy nursed its own grievances against Paris following French expansion into Tunisia, and that resentment made Rome a useful, if unreliable, partner. Bismarck harbored few illusions about Italian reliability. Rome would honor its commitments when honor was convenient. The Triple Alliance was a diplomatic tool, not a brotherhood. And so the web grew. Each thread had a purpose. The dual alliance secured the Austrian flank. The renewed Three Emperors Alliance kept Russia from isolation and therefore from mischief. The Triple Alliance boxed in France from the south. Viewed from Bismarck's desk in the Wilhelmstrasse, it was a masterwork of interlocking pressures and counterbalancing interests. Viewed from anywhere else, it was beginning to look like a system under continuous strain. Every commitment made to one partner created a tension with another. Every alliance designed to prevent a war contained within it the seeds of a different one. Russia and Austria-Hungary, both nominally Germany's partners, regarded each other across the Balkans with unconcealed rivalry. Bismarck believed he could manage that rivalry indefinitely, that his presence and his judgment were the mechanism keeping all the moving pieces from collision. He may have been right, but the system he was building assumed something that no statesman can ever guarantee. It assumed that he would always be there to run it. The question of what would happen to this intricate machinery when the hand that built it was finally removed still lay in the future. For now, Bismarck had one more problem pressing on him closer to home. By 1885, the fracture Bismarck had papered over was finally splitting open. The Balkans, that perennial source of trouble, provided the crisis. Bulgaria, a state carved from the ruins of Ottoman territory and nominally within Russia's sphere of influence, was causing St. Petersburg acute embarrassment. The Bulgarians, inconveniently, refused to behave like Russian clients. Their prince, Alexander of Battenberg, proved stubbornly independent, and when Bulgarian and Serbian forces clashed in the autumn of 1885, Russia found itself humiliated rather than triumphant. Austria-Hungary watched with undisguised satisfaction. That satisfaction was precisely the problem. For two powers supposedly bound together under the Three Emperors Alliance, Austria and Russia were behaving less like partners and more like rivals circling a disputed prize. By 1887, the pretense could no longer be maintained. The Three Emperors Alliance, already strained and twice patched, finally expired. After nearly a decade, Bismarck's most elegant construction had come apart over a small Balkan principality that most Europeans could not locate on a map. Any other statesman might have accepted this as the natural cost of doing diplomatic business. Bismarck refused. What he did next remains, even now, one of the most breathtaking feats of diplomatic improvisation in modern European history. In June of 1887, just weeks after the Dreikaiserbund collapsed, Bismarck sat down with the Russian ambassador Paul Shuvalov and signed what became known as the Reinsurance Treaty. The terms, on the surface, appeared straightforward. Germany and Russia pledged mutual neutrality if either became involved in a war with a third power. The exception, crucially, was if Germany attacked France or Russia attacked Austria-Hungary. In those specific cases, the neutrality clause would not apply. But here was where the audacity became almost vertiginous. Germany was simultaneously bound to Austria-Hungary under the dual alliance of 1879, pledging to defend Vienna if Russia attacked. And now Germany was pledging Russia a form of protective neutrality. How could both commitments exist at the same time? Bismarck's answer was lawyerly and brilliant. The Reinsurance Treaty's neutrality clause specifically excluded a Russian attack on Austria, which happened to be precisely the scenario the dual alliance was designed to address. In theory, no contradiction existed. In practice, the treaties pulled in opposite directions, and the gap between them was held together entirely by Bismarck's personal management of the information. The Austrians did not know about the Russian treaty. The Russians knew about the dual alliance but trusted Bismarck to keep Austria restrained. The entire arrangement depended not on institutional logic, but on one man's ability to simultaneously reassure contradictory partners that their interests were safe in his hands. To further stabilize the Eastern Mediterranean, Bismarck quietly encouraged a parallel arrangement that became the Mediterranean Agreements, informal understandings between Britain, Austria-Hungary, and Italy designed to resist Russian expansion toward Constantinople and the Straits. Britain was not formally allied to Germany, but British interests now aligned against Russian ambitions in precisely the way Bismarck required. He had effectively created an unofficial British buffer without signing a single treaty with London himself. Step back and consider what Bismarck had constructed. Russia was reassured by the Reinsurance Treaty. Austria was anchored by the dual alliance. Britain was nudged into alignment through the Mediterranean agreements. France remained isolated. The entire European state system was arranged, through a combination of formal commitments and carefully managed secrets, to prevent any war that might threaten German security. It was extraordinary. It was also, as later events would prove, extraordinarily fragile. Every thread of this web ran through the same pair of hands. Remove those hands, and the tensions the system was designed to suppress would have nothing left holding them apart. In 1890, Bismarck would be gone, and the Reinsurance Treaty, the keystone of the whole structure, would be the first thing his successors quietly set aside, leaving Russia with nothing and leaving the door open for the alliance that would one day face Germany in the most catastrophic war the world had yet seen. Foreign policy consumed Bismarck's reputation, but it was on the domestic front that his character revealed itself most completely. And what it revealed was not reassuring. The man who spent decades managing European chancelleries with surgical precision brought the same instincts home. Every domestic challenge was, at its core, a threat to be neutralized. Every political movement was an enemy to be broken, co-opted, or both. The first target was the Catholic Church. In the 1870s, the newly unified Germany contained a substantial Catholic minority, roughly 1/3 of the population, concentrated in Bavaria, the Rhineland, and the newly absorbed Polish territories. When these Catholics organized politically under the Center Party, Bismarck saw not a democratic constituency, but a state within a state, loyal to Rome before Berlin. His response was characteristically aggressive. Beginning in 1871, a series of measures stripped the Church of influence over education, required civil marriage, expelled the Jesuits, and placed clergy under state supervision. Bismarck called it the Kulturkampf, the struggle for civilization. The Church called it persecution. Both were essentially correct. The result was a spectacular miscalculation. Repression unified German Catholics behind the Center Party rather than fragmenting them. The more Bismarck pressed, the stronger his opponents became. By the late 1870s, he was quietly retreating, dismantling the very laws he had championed, seeking the Center Party's votes on other matters. The Kulturkampf ended not with victory, but with an embarrassed withdrawal. He had barely finished retreating from one battle before opening another. The rise of the Social Democratic Party alarmed Bismarck in ways no foreign power quite managed. Here was a movement explicitly committed to overturning the social order he had constructed. After 2 separate assassination attempts on Kaiser Wilhelm I in 1878, neither connected to the socialists, Bismarck exploited the public anxiety regardless. The anti-socialist laws banned socialist meetings, publications, and organizations outright. The SPD was effectively made illegal. And yet, the party continued to organize underground. Its vote share grew with almost every election. Repression was making martyrs. Bismarck recognized, at least partially, that the stick alone would not work. What followed was one of the most consequential policy reversals in modern political history. Between 1883 and 1889, Germany introduced compulsory health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions, the world's first comprehensive state welfare system. The motive was entirely cynical. If the state provided workers with security, workers might feel less need to follow socialist agitators. Welfare was a weapon against revolution. It failed on its own terms. The SPD kept growing. By 1912, it would become the largest single party in the German parliament. But the welfare state itself endured, copied by nation after nation across the following century, eventually becoming the foundation of modern social democracy everywhere. Bismarck had attempted to kill socialism and accidentally built one of its most durable monuments. The same ruthless pragmatism that shaped his foreign policy had produced, at home, a legacy far beyond anything he intended. 1888. In the space of a single year, 3 men would sit upon the German throne. Wilhelm I, the old Prussian warrior king who had given Bismarck his decades of power, died in March at the age of 90. He had reigned for 27 years. He had trusted his chancellor almost without reservation. Whatever friction existed between them, Wilhelm I understood at some fundamental level that Bismarck was the engine and he was the figurehead. The arrangement had built an empire. His son, Frederick III, stepped forward next. Frederick was a liberal, married to a daughter of Queen Victoria, and believed to harbor genuine sympathy for constitutional reform. Many Germans, exhausted by Bismarck's iron management of political life, quietly hoped for something different. They never got the chance to find out. Frederick was already dying of throat cancer when he ascended. He reigned for 99 days, governed largely from his sickbed, and was gone by June. Then came Wilhelm II. He was 29 years old. The new Kaiser was, by almost any account, a man of genuine intelligence and genuine instability in almost equal measure. Born with a withered left arm, he had spent a lifetime compensating, projecting aggression and certainty to mask insecurities that ran very deep. He was theatrical where his grandfather had been stoic, impulsive where Bismarck was calculating, and hungry for personal glory in ways that made the old chancellor deeply uneasy. Wilhelm wanted to be seen. He wanted to be the story. For a man like Bismarck, who had spent 30 years ensuring that he was the story, this was intolerable. The first serious clashes came over the workers. Wilhelm had watched the growing power of the Social Democrats and arrived at a different conclusion than his chancellor. Where Bismarck saw a movement to be crushed, Wilhelm saw an opportunity. Court the workers, soften the repression, present himself as a monarch who cared. In early 1890, he pushed for international labor conferences and proposed limits on working hours, positions that cut directly against Bismarck's harder line. Bismarck was not accustomed to being contradicted on domestic policy. He had built the machinery of German government specifically so that the chancellor, not the emperor, held the levers. But Wilhelm II had no interest in being managed. He had watched, from a young man's distance, as Bismarck maneuvered, dominated, and occasionally humiliated the men around him. He was determined not to become one of them. What followed was less a confrontation than a cold war between two offices. Bismarck attempted to reassert control by resurrecting stricter anti-socialist legislation, daring the Kaiser to oppose him publicly. He explored whether he could restrict the young emperor's access to ministers, tightening his own grip on information and communication within the government. He had survived 4 different political crises through exactly this kind of bureaucratic maneuvering. He believed he could survive this one. He was wrong about what he was dealing with. The problem was not political. It was personal. 2 men, each convinced of his own indispensability, each unwilling to occupy second place, could not share power. Germany was not large enough for both of them. By the spring of 1890, the collision that had been building for 2 years finally arrived at its conclusion. The question now was not whether Bismarck would fall, but what would be left standing when he did, and whether the system he had so carefully constructed could survive without the one man who truly understood how it worked. On the morning of March 18, 1890, Otto von Bismarck submitted his resignation to the Kaiser. He was 75 years old. He had served as chancellor for 28 years. The meeting between the 2 men was, by most accounts, cold and brief. Wilhelm II accepted the resignation without ceremony. There were no expressions of gratitude. There was no acknowledgement of what was being lost. Bismarck walked out. The departure from Berlin came 11 days later, on March 29th. At the railway station, something unexpected happened. Crowds gathered, far larger than the government had anticipated, pressing against the barriers to watch the old man go. Some wept openly. Officers saluted. Ordinary Berliners stood in silence as the train pulled away, as if watching something enormous disappear below a horizon. Whatever frustrations people had carried about Bismarck's methods, his manipulations, his ruthlessness, something in them understood that this was not an ordinary retirement. Across the channel, the British magazine Punch understood it too. On March 29th, the same day Bismarck's train left Berlin, Punch published a cartoon that would become one of the most famous political images of the century. It showed a great ship moving through calm water, its new pilot at the wheel, while down the rope ladder at the side descended an old man in a captain's coat. Stepping into a small boat, watched by no one on deck, the caption reads simply, "Dropping the pilot." Europe did not need the caption explained. The cartoon moved through diplomatic circles and newspaper offices from London to St. Petersburg within days. People who had feared Bismarck, resented him, and spent careers trying to outmaneuver him still grasped the same essential truth. Someone who knew exactly what he was doing had just been removed from the helm. Bismarck retired to his estate at Friedrichsruh in the forests southeast of Hamburg. He was not graceful about it. From Friedrichsruh, he watched the new government dismantle his work with what he considered criminal carelessness. The Reinsurance Treaty with Russia, his quiet insurance policy against a Franco-Russian alliance, was allowed to lapse in 1890. Wilhelm's advisors considered it too complicated, too secret, too much a product of one man's private diplomacy to be worth maintaining. Bismarck raged about this decision until his death. He was right too. He gave interviews. He spoke to journalists. He wrote his memoirs. He warned again and again that the alliances underpinning German security were being abandoned, that the careful balance he had maintained was being replaced by sentiment and bluster. Nobody in Berlin paid serious attention. He was the old man in the forest, the pilot already in the small boat, receding from the ship that no longer needed him. The question that haunted those final years, the question nobody in Berlin seemed to think worth asking, was a simple one. The system Bismarck had built, the alliances, the constitutional arrangements, the careful management of 5 great powers simultaneously, had been designed around a single extraordinary mind. It required someone who held the whole map in his head at once, who understood not just the rules but the dozens of unwritten agreements beneath the rules. Who understood it now? The answer, as the 1890s gave way to a new century, was becoming uncomfortably clear. What Bismarck had built was not a machine that could run itself. It was an instrument that required a virtuoso. And the virtuosos were gone, replaced by men of ordinary talent operating at extraordinary stakes. The pilot was in the small boat. The ship was picking up speed. The decision took less than 3 months. Leo von Caprivi was a capable man by most measures, a military administrator, competent and organized, respected in the right circles. He was also, by his own admission, no Bismarck. When the Reinsurance Treaty with Russia landed on his desk in the spring of 1890, he read it the way a new tenant might read an unusual lease clause, with confusion and mild suspicion. The treaty committed Germany to neutrality if Austria attacked Russia, while Germany simultaneously pledged support to Austria in other circumstances. To Caprivi's orderly mind, and to Friedrich von Holstein, the influential Foreign Office official who shaped so much of the new government's thinking, this was not diplomacy. It was contradiction on paper. Holstein's argument was straightforward. The treaty was too Bismarckian, meaning it depended entirely on one man's ability to hold contradictory commitments in balance simultaneously, to know exactly when each applied, and to ensure the relevant parties never compared notes. No normal foreign ministry could maintain it. And what happened, Holstein asked, if Russia showed the treaty to Austria? The alliance system would collapse overnight. The logic was not unreasonable. The conclusion it produced was catastrophic. In June of 1890, Caprivi allowed the Reinsurance Treaty to lapse. Germany sent no renewal offer to St. Petersburg. No explanation was offered. The Russians, who had valued the quiet back channel Bismarck had maintained for years, suddenly found themselves looking across a diplomatic landscape that had shifted without warning. The warmth was simply gone. The wire, as Bismarck had called it, had been cut. Russia's alarm was immediate and genuine. For years, the treaty had offered something invaluable: the assurance that Germany, for all its growing power, was not an enemy. Now that assurance had vanished, replaced by cool silence from Berlin and an increasingly assertive German posture in European affairs. Tsar Alexander III was not a sentimental man, but he understood isolation when he saw it. And so Russia looked west. France had been looking east for 20 years, ever since the humiliation of 1871, ever since Bismarck had stripped Alsace-Lorraine from her and left her nursing a wound that could not be spoken of and could not heal. France had the money Russia needed for railways and industrialization. Russia had the army France needed to threaten Germany on two sides simultaneously. The logic was mutual and obvious. The Franco-Russian alliance was formalized in 1894. Military conventions were signed. The two powers agreed that an attack on either by Germany or Austria would bring the other in automatically. Bismarck, watching from Friedrichsruhe, had seen it coming from the moment the treaty lapsed. This, he had warned for decades, was the nightmare scenario, the coalition that Germany's geography made existential. France on the west, Russia on the east, Germany in the middle, encircled, forced in any major conflict to fight on two fronts against enemies with superior combined resources. He had spent 20 years preventing precisely this. It had taken his successors less than 4 to bring it into being. What makes the story so striking in retrospect is how avoidable it was. Holstein and Caprivi had not sought this outcome. They had simply found Bismarck's methods too complicated, too personal, too difficult to sustain. They had tidied up what seemed like a mess. The tidying created the encirclement that would define German strategic anxiety for the next 2 decades, and that would eventually produce, in the summer of 1914, the desperate calculation that war on 2 fronts was better than waiting to be strangled by it. The first thread had been pulled. The shape of what would unravel was already visible to anyone willing to look. If Bismarck's foreign policy could be summarized in a single word, that word was restraint. Germany was satisfied, he had insisted. Satisfied powers did not threaten. They did not provoke. They did not need fleets or colonies or glory. They simply needed to keep what they had. Wilhelm II had no patience for satisfaction. From the moment he took power, the young Kaiser looked at the world map and saw humiliation. Britain had an empire spanning a quarter of the globe. France had West Africa, Indochina, Madagascar. Even little Belgium had the Congo. Germany, the most powerful industrial nation on the continent, had scattered territories in Africa and the Pacific that barely justified the cost of administering them. This, to Wilhelm, was intolerable. Germany deserved a place in the sun. Weltpolitik, world policy, would deliver it. The phrase sounded bold. The strategy behind it was dangerously vague. Where Bismarck had always known precisely what he wanted and what he was willing to risk, Weltpolitik was more mood than plan. It was assertion without architecture, ambition without clear limits. And in a world where the great powers had spent decades carefully calibrating their relationships, ambition without limits was explosive. The first serious damage came in January of 1896. Paul Kruger, president of the Boer Republic in South Africa, had just repelled a British-sponsored raid aimed at destabilizing his government. Wilhelm sent him a congratulatory telegram, praising the Boers for defending their independence against armed aggression. In London, the reaction was fury. The telegram implied German sympathy for British enemies, possible German intervention in what Britain considered its own sphere. It was not quite a threat, but it was close enough to one that the British public and press treated it as such. Wilhelm had sought to look strong. Instead, he had made his first serious enemy. Then came the ships. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz was a man of formidable intelligence and dangerous single-mindedness. He believed Germany's future was maritime, and he had the Kaiser's ear. In 1898, the first naval law authorized a substantial expansion of the German fleet. The second, in 1900, nearly doubled the target. Tirpitz called his approach the risk theory. Germany did not need to match British naval power completely. It only needed a fleet large enough that fighting it would cost Britain too much, even in victory. Britain would then back down or negotiate on German terms. The theory had one fatal flaw. Britain did not see a German fleet as a negotiating tool. It saw it as an existential threat. Britain's entire global position rested on naval supremacy. Its trade, its empire, its food supply, all of it depended on controlling the seas. A powerful German fleet, positioned across the North Sea, pointed directly at Britain's throat. Bismarck had understood this with perfect clarity. Keeping Britain neutral, or at least non-hostile, had been a cornerstone of his entire system. Britain off the continent, satisfied and unthreatened, was the condition that made German security possible. Wilhelm's naval program did not merely threaten that condition. It systematically destroyed it. British strategists watched the German shipyards with growing alarm through the early 1900s. Diplomats who had once seen no particular reason to align with France began to reconsider. The Entente Cordiale between Britain and France, signed in 1904, was not primarily about friendship. It was about a shared anxiety that had a German name attached to it. Bismarck had spent 20 years building a world in which Britain had no reason to oppose Germany. His successors had spent barely a decade giving Britain every reason imaginable. The encirclement that had begun with the Franco-Russian alliance was now closing from the west as well. The question was no longer whether Germany faced a coalition. The question was how long before that coalition would be tested. The Entente Cordiale, signed in April of 1904, had been mentioned at the close of the previous chapter almost as a footnote. In truth, it was the beginning of Germany's worst nightmare. The agreement between Britain and France did not create a military alliance. There were no promises of soldiers or ships, no binding guarantees of mutual defense. What it created was something arguably more dangerous, a habit of cooperation between two powers that had spent centuries as rivals. Colonial disputes in Africa and Asia were quietly resolved. Old resentments were set aside, and in their place grew something that Bismarck had dedicated his entire career to preventing. Wilhelm II, presented with the emerging alignment, chose the worst possible response. In March of 1905, he sailed to Tangier in Morocco, stepped ashore, and delivered a speech asserting Germany's interest in Moroccan independence. The move was calculated to expose French weakness and drive a wedge between Paris and London. It achieved precisely the opposite. At the subsequent Algeciras Conference in 1906, Germany found itself almost entirely isolated. Only Austria-Hungary stood beside her. Britain, Russia, Italy, Spain, and the United States all sided with France. The first Moroccan crisis, intended as a demonstration of German power, became a demonstration of German diplomatic failure. Worse, it convinced British military planners that France might actually need defending. Informal staff talks between British and French officers quietly began. Then came the final piece. Britain and Russia had been rivals across Central Asia for decades, their competition so persistent it had earned its own name, the Great Game. But in August of 1907, they signed the Anglo-Russian Convention, dividing Persia into spheres of influence and resolving their Afghan disputes. The agreement was limited in scope, but combined with the Franco-Russian alliance and the Entente Cordiale, it completed a ring around Germany that would have made Bismarck pale with horror. Germany's response in 1908 made the situation worse still. When Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, a direct provocation to Russian prestige in the Balkans, Germany issued what amounted to a diplomatic ultimatum to St. Petersburg, demanding Russia accept the annexation or face consequences. Russia, not yet recovered from its humiliating defeat against Japan in 1905, backed down. But the wound was deep. Russian statesmen and military commanders drew a stark conclusion. Next time, they would not retreat. Bismarck had spent 20 years ensuring that France had no friends. By 1908, Germany had accomplished something remarkable in its own right. It had united Britain, France, and Russia, three powers with centuries of mutual suspicion, into a single anxious coalition. The encirclement was complete. The question that would define the next decade was not whether the two armed camps of Europe would collide, but what small, distant spark might finally set them both alight. Bismarck had once dismissed the Balkans with characteristic contempt. The region, he declared, was not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. He was right, in a sense. The peninsula was impoverished, fractious, and impossibly complicated. But what Bismarck understood, and what his successors forgot, was that the Balkans did not need to be worth anything. It only needed to be dangerous. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had held the region in a loose, often brutal grip. By the early 1900s, that grip was failing. The empire that European statesmen had long called the sick man of Europe was dying visibly now, losing territory to nationalist uprisings and great power pressure. Into that vacuum rushed ambition. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro watched the weakening Ottoman hold and saw opportunity. In October of 1912, they struck. The First Balkan War lasted barely 7 months. By May of 1913, the Ottoman Empire had lost almost all of its remaining European territory. Cities that had flown Turkish flags for centuries changed hands in weeks. The victors then turned on each other. The Second Balkan War erupted in June of 1913 when Bulgaria attacked its former allies over the division of Macedonia. Serbia and Greece counterattacked. Romania joined the assault from the north. Within 2 months, Bulgaria was defeated and humiliated. Serbia emerged from both wars dramatically enlarged, its population swollen, its army battle-hardened, its ambitions sharpened to a point. In Vienna, the mood was something close to panic. Austria-Hungary looked at the new Serbia and saw an existential threat. The empire was a patchwork of 12 nationalities held together by bureaucratic habit and dynastic loyalty. Serbian nationalism, the intoxicating idea that South Slavic people should unite under a single banner, was a solvent that could dissolve Austria-Hungary from within. Every Serbian triumph sent a tremor through the imperial capital. The men in Vienna began asking a question that would prove catastrophic. Not whether to confront Serbia, but when. And in Berlin, the answer they received was essentially unconditional. German military and political leaders had developed a habit of thought that Bismarck would have found incomprehensible. Where the old chancellor had always asked what comes after, his successors asked only what wins now. Austria-Hungary was Germany's sole reliable ally. Losing her was unthinkable. And so Germany offered support without conditions, backing without limits, a blank check drawn on the future of Europe. No one in Berlin paused to ask what Austria-Hungary might do with such assurance. No one mapped the consequences 3 steps forward. Bismarck had always seen the board entire, every piece, every response, every counter-move. The men who followed him saw only the next move. The spark Bismarck had spent his life containing was almost ready to catch. It would need only a moment, a single afternoon in a provincial city, to finally ignite what decades of miscalculation had prepared. June 28, 1914 began as a Sunday parade. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, rode through the streets of Sarajevo in an open motorcade. The city was festive, the summer air warm. Somewhere in the crowd, a group of young Bosnian Serb nationalists stood waiting, each carrying weapons supplied by a shadowy Belgrade organization called the Black Hand. The first assassination attempt failed. A bomb bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded beneath the vehicle behind. Franz Ferdinand continued to his destination. It was only on the return journey, when his driver made a wrong turn and stopped to reverse on a narrow street, that Gavrilo Princip found himself standing almost close enough to touch the man he had come to kill. He fired twice. By early afternoon, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were dead. The pistol shots took seconds. What followed took 37 days, and it destroyed the world that Bismarck had built. Vienna's response was not grief. It was calculation, cold and long desired. Austria-Hungary presented Serbia with a 10-point ultimatum so deliberately humiliating that its rejection was practically guaranteed. Before the ink was dry, Vienna had already secured exactly the assurance the previous chapter described coming: Germany's unconditional blank check. With Berlin's backing confirmed, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination. Then, the machinery engaged. Russia, Serbia's great Slavic protector, began mobilizing its enormous but cumbersome armies. Germany, whose entire military strategy rested on the Schlieffen Plan, could not allow Russia time to organize. The plan demanded a rapid knockout of France in the west before turning east to face Russia. Speed was everything. And so Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st and on France 2 days later. To reach France quickly, German forces needed to pass through neutral Belgium. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality since 1839. When German troops crossed the Belgian border on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany before midnight. In 37 days, a wrong turn on a Sarajevo street had ignited a continental war. What is most striking, looking back, is not the speed but the passivity. Statesmen across Europe watched the crisis escalate and seemed almost unable to intervene. They sent telegrams. They held meetings. They expressed concern. But no one applied genuine pressure at the moments that mattered. No one stood at the center of the system and said, "This stops here." Bismarck had done exactly that repeatedly for 20 years. He had absorbed crises, redirected pressures, and convinced every power that restraint served their interests better than conflict. He had been the operator the machine required. The machine still existed in 1914. Every alliance, every military timetable, every calculation of prestige and honor traced back to the architecture he had designed. But the operator was long gone, dead for 16 years. And without him, the machine ran perfectly straight toward catastrophe. 20 million dead. That is what the machine produced. 4 years of industrial slaughter consumed a generation. Men drowned in the mud of Flanders, suffocated in gas clouds at Ypres, and froze in the trenches of the Eastern Front. By the time silence finally came on November 11th, 1918, 4 empires had ceased to exist: the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the German. The entire order Bismarck had so carefully constructed lay in ruins. The German Empire's end came with startling speed. Mutinies spread through the Navy in late October. Revolutions swept through Munich and Hamburg. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the impulsive young monarch who had dismissed Bismarck 28 years earlier, abdicated on November 9th and fled to the Netherlands. 2 days later, Germany signed the armistice. A republic was declared almost as an afterthought, proclaimed from a window of the Berlin Palace by a social democrat who had not planned to say anything that day. The nation Bismarck had spent his life assembling had dissolved in weeks. Then came the peace, and with it, something Bismarck had always dreaded more than war itself: humiliation. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the shots in Sarajevo, the victorious powers summoned German representatives to Versailles. The location was deliberate and the symbolism was brutal. They signed in the Hall of Mirrors, the very room where Bismarck had proclaimed the German Empire into existence in January 1871. Where Wilhelm I had been crowned Kaiser, surrounded by his generals, Germany was now forced to accept defeat, surrounded by enemies. The French had waited 48 years for this moment. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The wound Bismarck had always known was infected. The territory taken in 1871 that he had privately considered a catastrophic mistake was reopened and reversed. But the treaty went far beyond borders. Article 231 placed the entire guilt for the war on Germany alone. This single clause carried enormous consequences. Because Germany was declared solely responsible, it was legally obligated to pay reparations for all Allied losses. The final bill, set in 1921, reached 132 billion gold marks, a sum so vast it would not be fully paid until 2010. German territory was carved away. The army was reduced to 100,000 men. The navy was surrendered. Colonies were stripped. And the entire settlement was presented not as a negotiated peace, but as a dictated one. Germany had no meaningful voice in its own fate. Bismarck had once said that the Balkans were not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. He had built his career on the principle that lasting peace required that the defeated nation retain its dignity. A humiliated power, he understood, was not a pacified one. The men at Versailles had not learned that lesson. A young Austrian veteran, wounded and bitter, was watching closely. His name was Adolf Hitler, and he had drawn his own conclusions from what Germany had just been made to suffer. Bismarck had seen it coming. In his final years at Friedrichsruhe, exiled from power and growing old in the Hamburg countryside, he made a prediction that his visitors found melodramatic. 20 years after my departure, he told them, "It will all be over." He was wrong only about the timing. It took 24. What followed his removal in 1890 was not a single catastrophic mistake, but a slow accumulation of smaller ones, each compounding the last. The Reinsurance Treaty with Russia, quietly abandoned. The British Entente, never pursued. France, left isolated by Bismarck's design, finally finding the allies he had always worked to deny her. By 1914, every alliance he had constructed had inverted. Every fear he had managed had materialized. The system had not failed suddenly. It had unraveled, one thread at a time, in the hands of men who did not understand what they were holding. Then came Versailles, and the unraveling accelerated into collapse. The humiliation imposed in 1919 did precisely what Bismarck had always warned humiliation would do. It did not pacify Germany. It radicalized it. The Weimar Republic, born in defeat and blamed for surrender, spent its brief existence fighting enemies on every side. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the unemployment lines became recruiting lines. Hitler did not seize power through a coup. He was invited in by men who believed they could control him. They could not. By 1939, Europe was at war again. By 1945, 50 million people were dead. Cities lay in ash from London to Stalingrad, and the continent that had dominated the world for centuries had effectively destroyed itself. The age of European supremacy ended in a Berlin bunker. And so the question must be asked: who bears responsibility for this chain of catastrophe stretching across half a century? The answer is uncomfortable. Bismarck bears some of it. Not for the wars others started, but for building a peace that only he could maintain. He created a structure of such complexity, such personal dependence on his own judgment, that it could not outlast him. He mistook his genius for a system. He was not. He was a ceiling holding up a roof, and when he was removed, the weight had nowhere to go. Every institution, every nation, every organization that concentrates irreplaceable wisdom in a single person eventually confronts this truth. The genius departs. The system remains. And the system, it turns out, was never really a system at all. It was a man. Otto von Bismarck built Germany with his bare hands, held Europe together through sheer force of will, and predicted with terrible accuracy the moment it would all come apart. He was proved right about everything, including the one thing he could never fix, himself. That is not a story about the 19th century. It is a warning for every century that follows. Bismarck's legacy endures as history's starkest reminder that systems built on singular genius are, in truth, no system at all. Subscribe for more stories that refuse to stay in the past.